Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Love That Loves You Back, a podcast between myself, Valerie, and my dear friend Jonathan Freemantle. I'm an artistic miscreant, otherwise known as a self-described third-generation art professional, who's currently raising a fourth-generation art professional, born in the depths of the Pale of Settlement in the former Soviet Union, and partly raised in Australia, lived and worked in London and Paris, and 15 years ago, by a quirk of fate, relocated to Zimbabwe, where I'm the co-founder of First Floor Gallery Harare, trying to figure out life, education, art, and predominantly love of art as life goes on. And without further ado, over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, Jonathan Freemantle. I grew up in Cape Town and studied in London. I did a long apprenticeship in fine art in the old sense, and have been more making art in one way or another ever since then. I live in Edinburgh now, but I also lived for a while in Johannesburg, where I had Hazard Gallery, and that was the context that I met Valerie about 10, 12 years ago, and just loved the conversation we had immediately about painting and how painting is everything. And that conversation's been a constant source of joy and sustenance over the years. So it does make sense that we share the conversation, and look forward to where this goes.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it usually goes anywhere and everywhere, but somehow we always come back to art, and
Yeah,
because it is the love that loves us back. Thank you very
right.
much for joining us, and we look forward to sharing the journey. Hi, everybody. This week or this episode, we're discussing like part two of a conversation about portraiture and thinking through of what portraiture in particular means in the age of reproduction, let's just say, and post photography, because and specifically for painting, because it's become in many ways, in my view, a kind of a default with a lot of young artists, but I'm not sure that they're using it in the right way. That is to say, in a way, I feel that the use of photography has become a form of reduction rather than an enhancement. And so you're a contemporary portraitist. How do you use it? And then we can kick it off.
It's a good question. I've investigated that area quite thoroughly. I painted portraits completely from photographs, and I painted portraits completely from life. Much more of the latter, because I just feel there's so much more that comes through. It seems obvious that if you put the actual person in front of you, the painting should be better. But actually, it's more difficult because you're dealing with the essence and the presence and the kind of energy of that person. Whereas a photograph, you can reduce it to just form, line, tone, color. And and that's the danger. You end up with a flat image, which is liable to be read in only one way, which is your way. And actually, quite often that way isn't nuanced at all because you haven't been challenged. When there's someone sitting in front of you, your idea of them is constantly being challenged because they're changing, as we do, and they're not just changing in pose and the light effect or whatever the time of day. They're changing in being, as their mind moves and their thoughts wander, etc. And perhaps even on a more kind of deeper level, the being itself is shifting. And something does happen, it always feels magical when when through your difficulty of dealing with that and through their difficulty in A, being looked at for a long period of time, which is not normal, in an
Mm,
ordinary day, and B, the kind of when they go beyond the sort of discomfort of being seen and you go
mm,
beyond this discomfort of the sort of panic of not seeing, and in that space, the two meet, and quite often something profound happens, and you can always tell. I mean, I was thinking today, just in preparation of contemporary, let's say in the last 50 years, portraits that have moved me and kind of slapped me in that kind of in the way that a portrait looks like it was done yesterday, no matter how old it is. And we touched on portraits in the last portrait session about how they transcend time. They leap through time, and that Rembrandt self-portrait is in the room with you now. And I'm thinking of paintings like Germaine Greer, the portrait of Germaine Greer by Paul Arago is one. There's a kind of sort of forceful presence in that portrait, which is clearly the combination of two very powerful women, in the same small room done from life. There's Lucien Freud's portrait of Frank Auerbach and his portrait of Thyssen Bonamista, that big collector in Spain. They have this presence. There's a portrait by Andrew Wyeth in egg tempera called The Patriot, which is of an old former soldier wearing his old jacket. But it's so vibrant with presence. And I would say there's multitudes more of portraits that are so clearly done using the crutch of a photograph, and they're an image, but they have little or no presence. There's something in that for sure.
well, technically, you're not painting a person, you're painting a flatness,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's that interesting thing with some indigenous cultures where people are not allowed to be photographed because somehow uh, the camera takes something away from them, right? And I think in a way that's kind of a nice analogy for what a camera does. I mean, what a camera does, if you base your portrait on them, it's no longer, you're not actually painting a portrait. But I mean, there's also the drama you see of using like projections, just like, and it goes towards this idea of what is the right way of using technology to support your practice, right? Should it be, it shouldn't be a crutch, and then of course it should be something that elevates
Mhm.
rather than reduces. And I think it's kind of a trap that for a lot of young artists, I mean, I basically, refuse to look at anything that is a copy of a photograph. And then you have a lot of kids who said, look, he's, this is what I've done. I copied a picture from my phone. And you see actually in a lot of Instagram videos, artists, even established artists, just like painting while looking at their phone. And you kind of go, uh, is that really, because you're also like, think about it, you're also painting in a particular light that was already not the original light and not the original space, and you're completely lost all of that. And it's almost like believing that you are less than who you are, that your senses are not embodied in some way, and that's somehow okay. But can you I mean, just to get back to what you were saying before, I mean, would you imagine that, say, Lucian Freud used photography in any way? I mean, just
No,
speculate.
but there's a very interesting caveat to what you were saying. I think it is about how you use the technology. Freud only ever painted from life and
Mm,
from drawings. And I know for sure, when I go on these missions up into the mountain, for example, I take, hundreds of photographs because you can't not because it's so beautiful. And
Mm,
yet the two or three sketches that I will make,
mm.
I'll look at those sketches 10 years later and I'm like, I'm back in that
There.
exact place. And I think that's what a portrait from life does. However, there's someone like Francis Bacon who only painted from photographs. These were found images in books of injuries, but also he would commission photographers to take photographs of the sitter that he wanted to paint.
Mm,
And he then used those photographs as a kind of departure point. And he's drawing from an essence. And so those distorted portraits that he did of, of his people in his life, they feel like
mm,
that person's in the room. And I think as opposed to going, the image that was taken by the camera is the end,
mm.
and I'm now going to try and work towards that in paint. He's using it as the beginning, that's a different thing.
You can always tell if a photograph is involved as a reference image.
Yeah.
It's like,
Hockney's a
and
good one. Hockney's interesting. Like I think he uses photography. He's always been interested in technology, like his iPad drawings and etc. But then one of the portraits I wanted to reference as a great inspiration to me in the kind of last 50 years is that portrait from his like 60s, 70s era of it's Mr. and Mrs. Clark and Percy. You know the one, there's like the guy sitting on a nice mid-century chair with a cat on his lap, and she's standing at the window.
yeah, yeah.
And I think there's a photograph is part of it because it does feel quite flat. But then you know that he's done hundreds of drawings as well, and the drawing is the route to knowing about the image. So, and he's been quite explicit about, I think he did a whole program about Vermeer's use of camera obscura, essentially tracing, and how that's in the right way is a aid, not a handicap.
I mean, Vermeer is like the touchstone, is the
Yeah, right.
touch
Yeah.
for everything. Is that, I mean, remember that documentary? I don't know if we've referenced this
Hmm.
in the podcast before, that documentary about the guy who became so obsessed with the Vermeer that he rebuilt his whole entire studio, like,
Yes.
and and then also try to replicate, like, just spend like a fortune on replicating the technology. And I mean, it's quite a fabulous documentary.
Right.
I'll,
Yeah. You've told me about it. I haven't watched it yet.
it's, my new word is brillante.
Hmm.
It's so, I'm so naff. Um,
It's all right.
and like, I just feel like such a nerd. It's like, but it works. And and so basically after years he comes close to replicating the technique with using multiple mirrors and everything. I mean, he gets to
Yeah.
somewhere because it pains to prove that it was all technological, but the somewhere is still obviously not for me. It goes back to the idea of genuine authorship,
Yeah.
right? And that's sort of, in that way, kind of tangentially, goes back to what we talked about, why whatever is produced by AI, you know, in and of itself is not art because of authorship. And the
Yeah.
same way, and then we'll, just to anticipate our conversation about
Hmm.
fakes and frauds,
Hmm.
that, what is the concept of authorship and why it's relevant.
The other area that I love,
Mm,
that I think is important to discuss in like contemporary portraiture, it's not that it's more important now than it ever has been, but with the use of an image, like a photograph, etc., um, you have this kind of flatness that somehow dilutes meaning.
mm,
And I've been thinking about a few images I've seen recently, like Catherine Goodman, the artist who's she's more recently been showing with Hauser and Wirth, I believe, and they're kind of large abstract paintings. But she ran the Royal Drawing School for a long time, and her drawing is like on point. And one of her parents was passing recently, mother or father, and then these drawings done essentially at the deathbed of this parent. And I was crying looking at them. They're so beautiful. And I relate. I understand what that is. I spent a long time not doing portraits because when I was young, I was too kind of overwhelmed by the needs of the sitter, and I couldn't trust my own vision. But when I started doing it again, it came from an experience of meeting this man, Max Coleman, who was a kind of anti-apartheid titan, an incredibly important dude in Joburg, in his 80s, a little bit of dementia. So he had that presence that looked through you, but also a man that had lived this incredible life of service. And I was racking my brains after meeting him. He's the father of a friend of mine. Like, how can I spend some time with this person? That's not a bit awkward, Can I
I know you just said, look, I just want to hang out.
how can I spend time with him and then not be sort of taking him to feed the ducks in the park, And I asked to paint, it occurred to me that I could ask to paint his portrait. And it's such a privilege to have that intimacy. So, and something of that person is transmitted to you by the act of drawing from life. And I do believe that so to have images like Catherine Goodman's drawing of her dying parent, they're better than a photograph. They're better maybe than a poem, they're better probably than a film. There's something very specific about a drawing or a painting in that moment.
Because there's such a difference between a portrait and a likeness as well.
Yes.
It's sort
Yeah.
of and always talk about the problem of fascination with technique that is
Yeah.
very seductive to, let's just say, lay people,
Mhm.
uh, and in a way where it says, "Oh, look, it's so clean and it's so smooth and it's
Yeah.
so pretty and attractive," but that's not the thing, right? And how to communicate that space between a likeness and an expression.
Yeah.
And it's actually a genuine question of, like, for me as a communicator, when let's just say novice or aspiring collectors come and then they're saying, "Oh, look, I like this," and to explain to them that this is not okay. And
Yeah.
because, and you look like a terrible snob, but to say, all right, this is decoration that is, and I usually use in general conversation, the idea that you've been drinking Coca-Cola your whole life,
Mm.
and now and someone's going to introduce you to, at the very least, champagne, right? That's, and there's going to be a difference, immediate kind of
Mm.
transition, but it takes a certain education, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh,
There's also,
of
there's also
mm,
something, just as you were talking, my brain was operating in the background,
mm,
thinking about artists who've used sort of famous images that aren't their own,
mm.
and done something interesting with them. And immediately the first one that pops up for me are Marlene Dumas, her celebrity portraits, of Amy Winehouse and Osama bin Laden,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they have so much like
But
presence, and also empathy. They're not trying to kind of be political, if you know what I mean.
they're not trying, but would you call them portraits? Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
that's a good question. Yeah, are they portraits? Yeah.
Because in a way, I don't feel, you know, because then you're imposing, I also think part of
Mm.
the idea of portraiture is also a kind of a consent, in
Yes.
a
Yeah.
relationship,
Yeah.
right? And then also what you might be trying to achieve with a portrait of Osama bin Laden is perhaps not something that Osama bin Laden would have been choosing to achieve.
Yeah, no,
Do
that's really well said. And I
and
think
then
maybe that's where the a portrait stops becoming a portrait and becomes something else. Yeah,
Yeah, and it can just be a painting of a person
yeah,
because, and I think that's just valid because we're also throwing the term around, and I'm all about being more precise with terminology. And just because it's a painting of a person does not mean it's a portrait. And just because something is a portrait doesn't even need to be a painting of a person. Weirdly, and it's a fairly obscure reference, but Australia has historically had a really probably the wealthiest portrait prize in the world because even in the 1990s it was 100,000
mm,
Australian dollars, which was a, like when you think of the 90s, that was a huge, it's a life-changing amount of money for a painter. And and as long as so the Archibald Prize is a prize for a portraiture, but the subject had to be famous or had some sort of a celebrity. Weirdly, a lot of artists painted self-portraits, which is I thought was a great testament
mm,
to robustness of ego of a lot of artists. And but also some portraits were not actually, likenesses at all, which I thought was, you know, on behalf of the jurors or acceptance committee is a really forward move because again, something can be literally a portrait without
yeah,
having to speak the likeness. And I think that's kind of an interesting way of approaching portraiture as well, right? We are, what it means to communicate a person, like in
yeah.
the most abstract way. I mean,
Absolutely. I mean, you think of like there's a section of a Degas painting in the Scottish National Gallery, and
what intersection isn't they cut a bit out.
no. It's just a piece of the painting, but it's of his shoes. He's taken his shoes off, and they're sitting on the floor, and there's some red leather on the inside, so the sort of insoles are like Louboutin red, and he's done it in a single stroke. And I would say that you could cut that piece of the painting out, and that could be as much of a portrait of that man as the whole thing.
Absolutely. And it would be really evocative and
Very.
poignant.
Yes.
Yeah, of course it would be only a portrait at in a certain time and place, but that's all we've got.
Yeah. It's also
Yeah.
interesting that I was thinking the other day, were you talking about this relationship with the sitter, and it doesn't always mean that they have to like it. I mean, I painted my granny, who was very devout Methodist. When my grandpa died, she just sort of waited to go and meet him, but she didn't have enough. She was too Christian to will it, so she sat there in a kind of beautiful limbo waiting. And she had this Methodist prayer book she would read from. Her father was a Methodist missionary from Manchester. How's that for a tongue twister? And she was wonderful, very beautiful, sweet lady. So I painted her, but her face, when it relaxed, became quite glum. When she spoke, it kind of came alive, but I painted it in repose. And it's a portrait that I love, and it's probably the one of the few paintings I would grab in the house if it was burning. But when I showed her, she just said, "I look a bit glum." That's it. And
Yeah.
I think that sometimes you do take more than the sitter wants, or you do kind of present one aspect, and the sitter may not enjoy that. I'm not sure how the Queen felt about Lucian Freud's painting of her, you know.
No, I mean, it's you kind of have to have a certain amount of grace. I mean, it
Yeah.
to let go, and it's hard, right? I mean, but it also reminds me of that story of Picasso painting Gertrude Stein,
Hmm.
and and saying, well, I look, you know, like I look so old, and he, like this is
Yeah.
not. Well, I was saying something like, "This looks nothing like me," and he just said, "Wait 20 years."
Wow.
It's like, which is sort of this astonishing thing to say for a painter saying, "I don't really care. This is way beyond you right now."
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah, but it's which I also think it's a stunning portrait. I think it's
It
a
is. It's one of his
beautiful.
best, and for
Yeah,
sure, I agree. I think also the tenderness that you feel for the sitter, or it can be the kind of terror. There's something that comes when there is some frisson or something in the air. You notice that the painting is better, or this, or the drawing. In that realm, like Frank Auerbach's portraits, which are you could kind of lump them all in one sort of kind of aesthetic grouping, like who's who. This is supposed to be that person, and that's supposed to be a self-portrait, and yet they all look really reasonably similar. However, you do feel a specific struggle in each one, and I think that has to be to do with the person he's painting. There is something different, and he's 100% needed the sitter for that to exist.
for, for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. To get back to so contemporary, I'm just going to get really controversial about look, taking a deep breath, but like really, because a lot of people like to. I'm going to talk about uh people who've made kind of a bit of a name painting portraits, like Amy Sherrill,
Mhm.
whose work I've seen in person and was incredibly underwhelmed, and uh, precisely because of the incredibly derivative. Oh, you're painting with a tiny brush. Woohoo! Uh, it's so photographically derived and lacking in spirit, and actually fundamentally flat, but without without the intention, like the intentionalities find quite banal. And then you have peeps like, say, like Kahinda Wiley as well,
Yeah, I was going to
who
ask I was going to throw that one at you. Well, tell me,
no,
speak about him.
yeah, not a fan,
Yeah.
not a fan. I mean, it goes back to I don't have any fascination with technique, like so. Painting everything in infinitesimal detail again, and it actually goes back to fucking photography, right? Why would you do something that a camera can do in a microsecond?
Mhm.
So the skill is in something else. The skill is in the gesture. The skill is in what you can transmit as a human being,
Mhm.
like to another human being. It's an emotional communication. So that is the skill, is to clarify that communication rather than reduce everything to a mechanical process. The moment you step away, there is, it's also a kind of, and it's an interesting potential for conversation where the difference between craft
Mhm.
and craftsmanship in the practice of art and mechanical sort of reproductive quality, because there is a qualitative difference,
Very much.
because in artisanship and craft there is still the personalization of what you're doing, right? In everything, you're not only doing it, but you're doing it as yourself,
Yes, with feeling
as
and
yeah,
with
as a person, as with a person, with a distinct, individuality. And it might be require incredible amount of care and thought, but it's still individualized, whereas as opposed to mechanical. And I mean, with Kahinda, I don't know for a fact because I haven't seen, but my understanding is that a lot of his backgrounds are painted by assistants, etc., etc. So is it conceptual art now? I don't know. Is it conceptual if you've delegated the whole and it additionally, introduces another element, right? Like, so you have photography as a tool. A lot of artists today use assistants, right? Uh, that's seen as a sign of accomplishment, is how many assistants you can
Mm,
put in the
sure.
studio, right? Especially with sculpture and but also with painting, as we know, that is not a unusual practice in painting. You always
No, no.
and to delegate, but the very important things you always went in and had to do yourself, right? Like, isn't like if you're a
Yeah,
student painter, you could do the
exactly.
backgrounds, you
And
could do.
also the apprentices, say like Verrocchio's apprentice was Leonardo da Vinci, you know,
Yeah,
and then Peter Doig's assistant was Lisa Bryce, so yeah, rather than a kind of legion of non people who never get named, I think that's a gray area, but yeah, I totally agree. Keep going.
but no, my only point to that was is that you should take care of how you delegate your spirit. The central spirituality of your work is the essence, the communicative essence can't be delegated, right? Of course, if it's a purely conceptual work, then which happens so rarely, right? Like, you can't delegate, and again, to get back to photography, if you're delegating to it, then you're taking away rather than contributing to your practice. And I think that's possibly so if you're framing a practice, then the tools you use should be tools that support and enhance rather than taking the easy way out. There's no, like, it's essentially goes back to the point, there are absolutely no shortcuts
Good.
in
Yeah.
art, right? I think that's the way to end the thing, right?
Yeah, no, it's so true. And it's so tempting with portraiture to take a shortcut because of all the genres, there's so many things that can go wrong. You can paint a tree with a couple of branches looking wrong and it still looks like a tree. You can paint a face and you have no bandwidth to get it wrong. And then it still has to look like that person. And it's still
Yeah,
an interesting image. And I think those are the very reasons that it makes it more dynamic. And if you remove the sort of danger, you take the whole point away from it somehow.
yeah, the risk, yeah, you're right. The risk is the thing. That's a really brilliant conclusion. The risk is the thing.
Yeah.
But kids, get a skull in your bedroom, like go to a medical,
Yeah.
that's actually what I did. I don't know if I said that, but I'm sure I use it. Like, I lived with a skull as a 16-year-old. I had a skull in my room, and it had one of those skulls which you could open
Okay.
because kids in
Yeah.
med school. I don't know how my dad got it for me, but he's like the perfect father. He's like,
Thing
my
to
daughter
have.
paint portraits. I need a skull, let's get one. And I just obsessively drew that skull until it just embedded itself in my. So every time you saw a face, you were literally thinking through it. There's no shortcuts. It's everything's from the inside out. Everything matters.
Mm.
Kids, stop using cameras. Go and see the world.
Hallelujah.
Yeah.